say hello in chat. We are a community foundation, and the thing I love about being a part of a community foundation is that we get to work with everyone on every issue. We get to connect people and be a bridge for philanthropy to really hardworking sector, and at no time has the sector worked harder than today. It has been a challenging few months, and this gathering this morning is really an extension of the work we did in the spring when COVID started, and the release of a very important report, a report, to be honest, we did not intend to be doing another report this year. Our vital signs report is typically every 2 years, and it covers 2 years worth of data. The fallout report that you should all have received by now in your confirmation email and is available on our site live at this moment, was built on 7 months of data. It was built quickly by an incredible team because we felt we couldn't let this moment pass without going deep on data around really a layered challenge between a financial crisis, a health pandemic, and a cultural revolution, a much needed cultural revolution in this city and across the world. And so that's a lot of heavy stuff to talk about this morning, and I'm so glad you decided to join us. Please introduce yourself in the chat as we get started. So I think we knew we had to do this report because we believe inequality is one of the gravest issues of our time. The pandemic we knew the pandemic would make it worse for many vulnerable Torontonians, and especially for the under the radar organizations that keep them afloat. We know for sure that in this audience today, there's a big mix of folks. We've got our brave sector leaders supporting organizations that are struggling with increased volume, challenging financial situations. And we have funders in the room as well. Those that care enough about the city have been generous already, and we hope will continue to be generous as this crisis unfolds. Our shared experience over the spring, summer, and fall made it very clear that this report was essential, that along with our own experience at the foundation with unprecedented levels of granting to frontline organizations and others who are just trying to keep the lights on. This report is arguably the most comprehensive picture of all the compounding impacts of COVID. By using an equity lens, we zeroed in on how factors such as race, income, age, and geography have influenced both whether or not you got sick and how physical distancing has affected your life too. We know this is as much a mental health crisis as it is a physical health crisis. But it is quite different in that we only zoned in on 7 months worth of data. That's very different for us and compared to the typical 2 years that we would normally do for a vital signs report. And as you're going to see, if you haven't read the report yet, the findings are stark. That's what I mean when I say it's great to be in community, but we have to have a difficult conversation. But I think it's also really important to say, especially today, that this is not our story to tell. We, as an organization, as a white leader at this time, and as you'll see in the data, 80% of the sector is led by white leaders like me. It's not our story. We're sharing this report as an expression of our allyship. We are the bridge to philanthropy, and we hope this report will center the leadership of the sector experts themselves who live and breathe the realities of inequality every day. I'd like to thank our lead researcher, Steve Eyre, and our lead qualitative research, Gobi Suriran, I'm sorry, Gobi, I'm gonna do that again. I'd like to thank deeply Gobi Suriran Ganathan, our lead qualitative researcher, for the intense research they did in such a short period of time. And a special thank you to Van City Community Investment Bank for supporting us in the early days of the pandemic and now sponsoring this year's report. But we really can't take a step further in this conversation without acknowledging that we are currently all working on the lands of the Indigenous family we are now find ourselves a part of, who have been here thousands of years before we arrived. And Toronto has traditionally been a meeting place for many of those communities, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. We have to thank Lindsay Kretschmer, who's on the panel today, and a dear friend to the organization and an incredible leader in the Indigenous community in Toronto, for her leadership, especially through the pandemic. You're going to hear the amazing work the organization she represents and beyond have done to support Indigenous folks. And we are so grateful for that relationship and all we've learned about reciprocity through that work. So we've got a lot to share with you today. I could go on, but I think you will start with a short video that's going to give you the highlights of the report. I appreciate the report. We call it a companion report. It's 100 pages long. We would understand if it's going to take you some time to read it, although Ty Wynn, our moderator today, has already admitted to me he's read it word for word, front to back, which we very much appreciate. But we thought we'd start with a summary that just helps set the tone for the conversation Ty's going to host in a few minutes. I'll throw it to video now, Aruna. So that gives you a sense of what you'll find in the pages of our Fallout report, and you're going to hear from some of the folks that are quoted in that report next. But I want to just say out loud this, why this report? Well, why another report? I think there's some key things I want those in the audience to think about as they're listening today. One, we wanted to create a really easy space for donors and funders to find the gaps that still exist during this crisis and fund them, volunteer for them, get involved with them, take action. And for our beloved leaders in the sector to try and save them some time, create a document that they could use to build their case for more funding from funders, from government, to make it easy to build that case. And I hope you're going to see that we've done that. I hope that you will give us feedback, and I hope that you will connect with each other during the call today. The last thing I want to say about chat before I introduce Ty Wynn is we have a lot of experts in the audience. If a question comes up, and we invite you to put your questions in the chat, and you are an expert in that area, you have lived experience in that area, don't hesitate to answer. We can, unlike being in a theater where no one can talk to each other when the panel's going on, you can talk to each other here, and we encourage that. And we encourage you to connect with each other. So thank you for doing that in advance and participating in your way. But I'm now delighted to introduce our moderator, Ty Wynn. He's currently the creative director at Open Lab, which is part of the University Health Network, as well as the editor-in-chief of the independent magazine that we are so proud to support, The Local. It's an award-winning online magazine that explores urban health and social issues in Toronto. And check it out at thelocal.to. And I know one of my colleagues will put that up in the chat so that you can become a subscriber too, because it tells the stories that need to be told. And we're so glad to have Ty here today as a moderator. One final thing about Ty, and I know some of the fund holders in this group volunteered for this program. During the pandemic, Ty and his colleagues wanted to help seniors. And so they created the Friendly Neighborhood Hotline, one of the mutual aid groups that has popped up this year and shows the community that we want to continue to foster in this city. And you can read more about it in our report. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ty, to take over.
Thanks, Sharon, and hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. First of all, big thanks to the whole Toronto Foundation team for putting together the Fallout report, all 134 pages of it, which I read over the last few days. 134 pages of piercing insights into the knock-on effect of COVID-19. The document could not be more comprehensive, and its conclusions could not be clearer that the burden of the pandemic has not been shouldered equally across our city, and that equitable recovery and certainly an equitable approach to the second wave that we're currently in now is absolutely paramount. So well done to the whole team and everybody involved in the report. I imagine that sometime in the future, when COVID is a distant memory and historians go searching for a comprehensive account of what actually happened in Toronto in the year 2020, that this document will be something that they'll be looking for. So please download it, read it, share it, and I guess importantly, try to do something about it. So for this morning, and before we turn it over to the speakers, let's quickly go over how this thing is going to work. We're going to start by spending some time with each speaker, probing different aspects of the report. And then we've got a story to share, and then we'll get back together and have a roundtable discussion before we open it up for questions with the audience at the very end. Please write your questions down in the chat box in the sidebar as they occur to you, and we'll be tracking those and picking them up later. You note that this webinar is now webcasting live on YouTube, so please act accordingly and try to stay safe and be respectful to each other in this space. And I'm going to start by introducing our panelists one by one and hear what they each think about the report. So let's get started. Okay, let's first meet our first speaker, Agapi Josesa. Agapi is a member of the Premier's Council on Equity of Opportunity, and Agapi has been working in the nonprofit sector for the past 10 years. Since 2018, she's been the executive director of C, Center for Young Black Professionals. The organization was founded in 2012 and operated as an initiative of the Youth Challenge Fund for 6 years before that. It's great to have you here this morning, Agapi. Let's get right to it. The first question I have for you is the Fallout report talks about how the unemployment for youth rate right now is at around 18% for white youth. And yet, when you look at this number for youth who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that number jumps to a whopping 32%. How is your organization seeing this play out right now?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. I think it's important to reflect on pre-COVID, and pre-COVID, Black and Indigenous youth had a very high unemployment rate compared to their white counterparts already. And I think if you look at the Stats Canada, data that has been compiled here in this report as well, but it breaks down Arab, South Asian, Black, and Indigenous youth. What do all of those groups have in common? They are all visible minorities. When you see them, you know that they are who they are, or possibly by their names, etc. And so I think that that's something to really note. I think a lot of the times, and part of the reason why it was so important for Stats Canada to start to break down based off of race, and as well as a report like this, is because we needed data, because for a long time, this seemed to have been some type of a myth, or something that people of color were, the notion that we are the first, the last hired and the first fired was something that for some reason people thought was just preposterous and we were making it up. These are the stats that tell us exactly what is going on. And I think that prior to the pandemic, one of the first things that I thought about when the pandemic hit for us as an organization is we're in the business of finding employment for young people. We identify 5 major labor gaps in the Canadian market. And the reason why we identify gaps is because we want to look at where people are not occupying space so that we can train up our community so that they can take advantage of those jobs. In the midst of as soon as COVID hit, the first thing I thought to myself is it was still difficult, but easier to find Black youth employment when everyone else had a job. Now that everyone, there's a large number of people who are unemployed, that means that once again, we're going to be put to the back of the line. And so what we're doing as an organization is really reflecting on the industries that we once saw labor gaps in. Hospitality was one of them. We're looking at our information technology programs and saying, okay, where is there very high demand so that our young people are not put at the back of the list, and how quickly can we train them so that they have a hand up on everybody else because they have the skills and they're ready to go. So that's how we're trying to navigate this. I mean, the reality is it was the same prior to the pandemic as it is post-pandemic. We just have more people who are unemployed now, which means we have a lot larger of a job to do.
Mm-hmm. And this really hit close to home for you guys, didn't it? I saw in the report that of your 266 alumni, 144 of them lost their job during COVID-19. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think for our membership, we're in the business of helping these young people find employment. So we've just, found everyone employment, people who've maybe graduated 2-3 years out. And now the pandemic hits, and immediately our team had to figure out and system navigate for these young folks, right? So in the beginning, to apply for CERB, you had to have your taxes done. We had to find volunteers who were going to do the young people's taxes. Some of them hadn't done their taxes in years, right? So, and then the government said, okay, no, we're going to make it easier. We're going to do CERB this way. So there's a lot of moving around and trying to navigate those spaces. And for a lot of our young people, 142 of them, we had to help them apply for EI or help them apply for CERB or figure out what benefits that they can get. And in the midst of all of that, you're really dealing with the emotional toll that takes on young people, and the panic and the worry. What's going on in the world, number one. Now what's going on in my household? How am I going to navigate? I think for a lot of our young people, and 142 is a lot. It's a really large percentage of our membership. And so we went from serving maybe 15 to 30 young people at any given time intensely to now a huge caseload of 142. And so I think for us, that's a small sample size. But when we look at the entire city of Toronto, you know, I really think about if other Black youth who are not connected to our organization or Indigenous, et cetera, who are not connected to agencies, like how are those folks coping as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. As part of the report, Toronto Foundation conducted their own survey of the Toronto nonprofit sector. And here's one of the findings that's in line with the feedback that you provided in the report. Only 18% of the largest organizations surveyed indicated that they were BIPOC-led, compared to 38% of the smallest organizations. And of course, we know that about half of the Toronto population is BIPOC. So tell me give me some reflections on that stat.
Yeah, part of the work that we do at C is also supporting 3B organizations. So when I say 3B, I'm referring to Black-led, Black serving, and Black focus. There's a lot of amazing organizations doing the work that just can't seem to grow. They don't have the capacity and the resources or the connections because really the funding world is relationship built, right? You build relationships with these institutions and that's how you build trust and really an opportunity to prove that you are doing great work. Most organizations that are, you know, when I look at the ONNs and I look at, you know, the larger nonprofit sector as we're doing this work, I often see the Black social service sector as its own entity on its own. It has its own ecosystem, et cetera. And I strongly believe that, you know, people of color are going to be able to find the solutions for their communities. And the reality is, if we look at the stats of people who have food insecurity, have housing insecurity, these are people of color. And so why are they not leading these organizations? Because we know our communities best. There's no way that I, as a Gapi Gasessa, could know what it's like to be a white man in Canada. I'll never be able to experience that till the day I die. What I do know is I know that even if it's, and I have lived experience, but even if I didn't have lived experience, I have cousins and aunts and uncles and people in my community that I'm closely tied to that I have probably know someone or know the issues in my community. Why is it that we have folks who do not look like us? And it's not because there's a lack of talented people of color who cannot take up these spaces. Why is it that there seems to be a glass ceiling of some sort in this sector where we're unable to enter into larger organizations that are well-resourced, that have all of those things. And there's also not, I think until this moment, really an intentional effort to reach down and see what's going on the ground in these smaller organizations that are doing amazing work. And so I think what ends up happening a lot of the time in the social service sector, people are here because, you know, we're not all here for like a big, huge paycheck. Like this is not the industry for that, right? So most people are here because we're passionate about it. We have lived experience. We understand our communities. We have a passion for our community. So how can we why is it that larger organizations are not being taken up by folks who are people of color that are perfectly qualified to do so? So I'm hoping that from this pandemic, when we come out and we think about equity lens in terms of employment and all of these other pieces, that we're also thinking about equity in terms of the social service sector and what agencies get funded versus not, how we're equipping organizations, because this often happens in community and we see it a lot. As you make a quota, you come into a community who you have no relationship with, you know, they didn't even know they were going to get invited. And they say, okay, we're hiring. Or for instance, with funding, okay, there's a funding call out, but there's been no intentional capacity buildings to prepare that person or that organization to be able to step into that. And that in itself is an act of racism. And I think we need to acknowledge that and really think about how we're funding folks, where we're funding them. And perhaps the smaller organizations that are BIPOC led could come to a place of mainstream, organization that becomes a lot larger given resource and attention. So I'm hoping that either of the two end up happening.
Thanks, Agapi, and I look forward to having further discussions with you in the roundtable. So now we're going to move ahead and introduce the next speaker, Mohini Dada-Ray. Mohini has been working in the nonprofit sector for the last 10 years. She was the director of the Provincial Women in HIV/AIDS Initiative before becoming the executive director of the North York Women's Shelter 5 years ago. She advocated for and led a paradigm-shifting $22 million capital rebuild and reopened the doors of the shelter 2 weeks before the pandemic. North York Women's Shelter was founded in 1984. Thanks for joining us this morning, Mohini. First question is, in March, when the city first went into lockdown, call volumes for assaulted women's helpline went up by about 50%. By the time April and May hit, those numbers went all the way up to 75%, with almost 4,000 calls monthly. What has that meant for you and your work?
Yeah, thanks, Ty. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. Yeah, it's very interesting, actually, because while the call volumes have gone up at Assaulted Women's Helpline, and as you saw, by 75%, what we're experiencing as shelter leaders in the city of Toronto is a drop in volumes of calls to actually come into shelter. So, we actually banded together as a group of shelters, violence against women shelters, to try and figure out this issue, because it doesn't make intuitive sense, obviously. But then there's something happening here under pandemic conditions that is, causing survivors of violence to make more calls, and yet showing reluctance to actually go into shelter. So in terms of our work, it's actually been trying to figure out that question, and then also balancing that with the kind of severe mental health impacts of the pandemic on survivors of violence, and the lockdowns, and the fact that any kind of supports. We talked about arts organizations being so precarious at this time, and I really want to at this point highlight the importance when it comes to arts and culture in terms of mental health for communities and for individuals, and how important it is for us not to lose that, because really that's been the lifeline for a lot of survivors when we've been able to offer that. And more we're having to go virtual, which creates these lack of, we talked about relationships, ability to build relationships for families fleeing violence in their homes. So in order for us to kind of understand what's happening between the gap between the calls and the intakes, we've put together this little ragtag group of shelters. We've scrounged around for some funding here and there, which speaks to a couple of things. So one is the lack of a plan, in figuring out what is happening to survivors of violence, when we know that issues like pandemics, floods, war, any kind of big crisis moment actually increases domestic violence. And we know this globally. We knew to anticipate it. And yet there isn't a discernible plan on how to address it. What we have heard from survivors is the reluctance to go into shelter right now has to do with a couple of things. So one is obviously the fear around COVID in congregate living spaces, with good reason. We've seen it across shelters in the city. The other is, as Agapi was saying, the pre-existing conditions that communities are impacted by already pre-COVID. So housing in a heavily gentrifying city where housing is becoming so difficult to access, people are terrified of leaving really violent situations because they're not sure what's going to happen afterwards. And we know that, communities of color in particular are being pushed out of the city. Where we're located in the Northwest. We saw the map. Rates of COVID are 10 times higher there. And so it means that, again, with good reason, the conditions to the deal to come into shelter means that you have to agree to a level of lockdown that, again, is very unacceptable, right, for a lot of people. So really what we are advocating for is a few things. So one is, investing in the infrastructure in the neighborhoods and these communities and these organizations that has been lacking. the reason I wanted to mention the rebuild that we did and opened 2 weeks before the pandemic is because it was survivor-led. We were very, very intentional about going to the communities who are accessing services to lead the design of the building. And that's why it was an expensive build, because it takes investing in the places that we think are important in order to make a shift. And that allowed us to not just stay at capacity even though it was 2 weeks before the pandemic, but actually increase capacity at a time where most other shelters in the city, in order to protect its residents, had to decrease its capacity right when survivors needed us the most. And that's because infrastructure has not been invested in so long. And we cannot continue to think that communities that need us the most have to do with the least and have to do with honestly the most substandard conditions of living, whether it's the built environment or whether it's these institutions that we are supposed to support these communities, and that's going to that's acceptable anymore. So it's not acceptable from an equity lens, and equity is about shifting power back from the center to the margins, and it's really a lens that I think we need to be very serious and intentional about. Sharon mentioned, community support and donor support at this time. And I really want to shout out to the community and to donors without whom I don't know how we would have continued operating. Our expenses have skyrocketed. I think we are, having to bring in, I would say about an $80,000 extra a month in order to operate at a level that's safe for survivors of violence. And that's a combination of some government funds that are available, but also community. But we need a plan, and people need to know what that plan is, rather than, us, again, like I said, scrounging around trying to look for dollars where they're available, and donors having to make decisions, based on kind of individual interest as opposed to a larger equity-based direction and messaging that comes from government.
Great. Thanks, Mihi. We'll certainly come back to some of those themes later in the roundtable. Now let's chat with Emmanuel Malice, who has been working in the sector for 25 years in various roles, including philanthropy. Emmanuel has been appointed by the mayor to the Partnership and Accountability Circle of the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism plan. Currently, he's the executive director of the Network to Advance Black Communities and principal at Amon Consulting. Welcome, Emmanuel, and let's jump right into some of the data. Only 1/4 of Black Torontonians believe that police treat members of their community fairly, compared to 3/4 of, let's say, white Torontonians. The stats underscore why this is the case. Just looking at one data point, Black residents are 20 times more likely to be shot by the police. And you've got the Wellesley Institute publishing a report not too long ago showing that following the previous recession, we saw rates of eviction twice as high in predominantly Black neighborhood. The threats to the safety and security of Black Torontonians seems abundantly clear. So how do we address these deep-rooted issues in a real and meaningful way? Emmanuel, are you there? Are you on mute?
Myself. Yeah, thanks, Ty, and Toronto Community Foundation for having me. I think some of the stats that you mentioned, Ty, they are pronounced and invisible now, but they have been there for quite some time. And they are not new to the Black community, especially in the context of the safety and policing issues. As all of us know, Black communities have been calling for alternatives to policing and new forms of safety and well-being for quite some time. And I think, from a provincial legislature, community safety and well-being plan perspective, I think there's an opportunity for us at the city to be able to really look at alternative models of police response, especially around mental health crisis calls and calls around wellness checks, and issues when there are, low-level disputes among community members. So I think for a real solution here, we need to be able to go back to the drawing board and engage the City of Toronto and others from a policing perspective, including the mayor and the police services, and have the difficult but necessary conversations. The data is manifestly evident now because of the pandemic, but these are generational challenges for our communities. They are not new. This week, sadly for my family, we mark the second year anniversary of a young person who lost it in our extended family, a close friend of my son, who lost his life to gun violence, and the pain and the trauma that we have seen his family and the impacts even on my son and his friends is very, very difficult to really live with. These are real issues for Black communities. And I think what the pandemic is doing and what the intensity of the assault on anti-Black racism that we have seen globally and nationally and locally in this country post-George Floyd requires us to really stop tinkering at the edges. I think we need to be able to look at engaging in a bold way around the issues of policing and community safety. And I think we need to go back to the source of the problem here. I think intervention and other strategies are important, but also we need to approach this from a social determinants of health perspective. We need to be able to, part of stopping to tinker at the edge for me is like, we need to stop treating the symptoms, the tips of the iceberg, so to speak. Yeah, there are a number of underlying causes that are related to this challenge for Black communities that are systemic in nature, that require collaborative solutions. And we've been here at NAPS, we've been advancing this concept of the Black ecosystem. We must be able to really bring Black community leaders and the local government, the police services, and all stakeholders to really be in discussion to have, as I was saying earlier on, difficult but necessary conversations. The solutions are clear. We need alternative models of policy. Well, we don't need the police to be there when there's a crisis situation, We need to be able to invest in Black organizations. I mean, earlier, Agapi was talking about the Black-led, Black-focused, and Black-serving organizations. We have leaders, we have capacity in the Black communities here in the city and racialized communities for that matter. I know in this call, we have a lot of allies from various social justice communities here that collectively have been calling for a just engagement, so to speak, around policing in the city. And I think it's very, very important to work with the mayor and police services and Black communities and allies to really take the bull by the horn here. We need alternative policy models. We need to address the social determinants of health. And more important, we need to invest in community and social services. We need to redirect some of the investments to be able to address the root causes of safety and security in our communities. And unless we do that, we cannot make progress. And I think one point to consider for us is like, unlike in the past, we have at the City of Toronto now, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. There is a plan in place with recommendations and actions. And some of the recommendations and actions literally look at community safety and security. And we need to be able to work with the premises of the plan, with the unit, the city. But most importantly for me, we need to get families impacted by the violence. We need the community organizations at the table to be able to propose the solutions and move away from this command and control, police-focused approach to safety to one that takes into consideration the social determinants of health, but also puts the power back in the hands of community.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Really appreciate those insights, and I'm sorry to hear about your loss on the personal side. Our final panelist this morning is Lindsay Swooping Hawk Kretschmer. Lindsay is Toronto-born and raised, Mohawk and German. She's been working in the sector for 20 years. She's currently serving as Executive Director of the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, a coalition of up to 17 Indigenous organizations here in the city. Lindsay, it's great to have you with us here. First question for you is, you work closely with 18 leaders steering committees serving nonprofits in the city here. How have Indigenous service providers responded to the needs of the community during COVID-19?
There you go. Good morning. Thank you, Ty. Thank you to Toronto Foundation for the opportunity. There we go. Can you hear me now? Excellent. Okay. So in answer to the question, Ty, I think for the urban Indigenous social serving sector in Toronto, one of the first things I think I would point out, for us, it was really a matter of acting quickly, swiftly, and responsibly to address the varying needs across the city of Toronto for urban Indigenous folks who were affected most by the pandemic. It's an interesting sector, you know, the Indigenous social serving sector and sort of extended community beyond that sector alone. You know, we're small, but I would say pretty mighty in that, you know, we worked very hard as a coalition to come together, to plan, to strategize, to be tactful. You know, organizations at the task table. So there are 18 independent Indigenous-led organizations that make up our coalition. And these different leaders came together, put their minds and hearts together to come up with solutions for how to address some of the key challenges. And one of those challenges for us is geolocating Indigenous folks in the city. There are an estimated anywhere from 70 to 80,000 Indigenous folks who live in Toronto, and it's sort of tough to pinpoint where the pockets of you know residency lie within the city, and so there aren't large clusters like there are in some communities here in the city for Indigenous folks. There are some parts of the city that do have that, but by and large, we're pretty scattered all over the place. So it really did take a lot of thought, leadership, and commitment to responding in a way that made sense. And so we did go through a mapping exercise. Very early on, we were in contact with a lot of our funders and friends in the community to try to get a sense of what the pulse was, what were the needs. And we had the good fortune of being, you know, really well connected to, I think, a lot of funders and friends who really stood in solidarity and support of what we were trying to achieve. And so we did a lot of fundraising in the early stages of this in an effort to support member agencies to self-determine their own responses to how they were going to help community. And we did things like providing families with Wi-Fi connectivity, devices, food security, food deliveries, shelter and housing through, you know, alternative mechanisms like hoteling, helping folks who are being released from incarceration, continuing to support through legal system and justice responses for folks being served in that area. And it just goes on and on. I think, you know, when we think about the urban Indigenous social serving sector being so small, the fact that we were able to respond the way we did, and we didn't wait for, you know, whether or not we had funding, we didn't wait for permission, we did what we had to do. I think we're also very fortunate to be very well connected, to have a good sense anecdotally of the pulse on the community, to understand what the needs were. We surveyed some folks in between, I want to say April, I think it was March to April. So it was a very short window of time, but in that time of less than the 200 respondents, more than 50% of those Indigenous folks we were providing support to were single parents or identified as. So there were, you know, some severe gaps, I think, for some folks in the community. Two-spirit folk, elders, Indigenous youth, and women with children certainly stood out as being those that were most affected, and disproportionately so. I want to give a shout out to Task and all of the many members to, you know, acknowledge the tremendous strength and willpower that you have to keep going every day, because contrary to popular belief, things didn't slow down for us. We didn't stop. We didn't take a breath. We just kept going. And so I just want to honor my colleagues and the amazing work that they and their agencies have done. You know.
But you know, it's a perpetual issue here in the city, trying to have a sense of what the true impact is on this community when we don't have all the facts or the data at hand. So we'll come back to that. So thanks, Lindsay. And now I think we want to, before we move into the roundtable discussion, Toronto Foundation does have one more voice it wants to bring into the conversation, and that's the voice of a young Indigenous woman named Jamie. Jamie is currently being supported by the Native Child and Family Services of Toronto organization. Here she is in her neighborhood sharing her own experience of life during COVID-19. So we can cue that up, please.
So I had a baby during the pandemic. It was terrifying. Nurses and doctors, they helped me a lot. My mom was there. She was able to be in the room, so that was awesome. I wasn't alone. Some women are actually being forced to do it by themselves. I'm a single mom, so I get to spend the whole day and night with my baby. Wake up, feed her, we watch the Wiggles. I like to watch the Wiggles too. I do activities with my daughter. We did paintings, go for walks, just hanging out with my baby. I video chat my mom every day. I have been seeing my mom once in a while, but I try to be very careful with it. I didn't get a baby shower. Nobody really got to come and see the baby, so that was hard for me too. The fact that I'm a single mom and I can't really have my family around, just being on my own with the baby is hard without pandemic. My situation with my daughter is kind of complicated because my first child was apprehended and I lost her to Children's Aid, and so that was also a very scary part of having my baby now. And I got to be able to keep her at home and raise her. I have Susan, my prenatal worker at Native Child. She's mine in Noche. I kept in contact after I lost my daughter with Native Child and Family Services, and that was 2014, so I still have a lot of connections over there. And when I got pregnant with my daughter this time, I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose her, so I reconnected and I've had nothing but supports. Anishinaabe Health Prenatal Group and Regent Park Prenatal Group and Queen West, so they help me out once in a while. They'll call me, check on me, see if I'm doing okay, email me resources, help me out if I needed Canna formula or something. But they were helping me with food cards, diapers. Sometimes people don't like to ask for help, so maybe just kind of trying to take initiative. I know a lot of people feel bad when they ask for help, even though they really need it.
Jamie is not obviously here with us today, but I think we all appreciate the kind of courage it took for her to share her story, her intimate story about life in the city during this very difficult time. So thank you, Jamie, for that. So at this point, I want to bring all the panelists back together for our roundtable group chat. And a reminder to everybody to please add your questions to the chat box. We'll take those up momentarily right after the panel discussion here. Mohini, why don't we start with you? In the report and in the cover of the Fallout report, it includes a quote from you. And the quote says, "No one who isn't white and wealthy wants things to go back to the way things were." And that makes me think of several questions to get this discussion started. So we're talking about an equitable recovery and obviously an equitable approach to stage 2, which we're currently in right now. But how do we start to do things differently?
Well, I mean, I would say that, reflecting on why that is, right? Like why it is that folks who are people of color or Indigenous and not sort of sitting at the center of power and wealth are all in a pretty definitive single voice saying that everything needs to change. We have to rethink everything. And by rethink everything, I mean that, power, the way that it continues to rest in this country and in this city reflects the way that Canada was designed to operate, and Canada was designed to operate to remove resources through colonialism and genocide, and those are just those are historical truths that are ongoing that we have to contend with and we have to think about, and it is uncomfortable and it is, but it's critical. And so when we think about communities of color and the way that we continue to be impacted in the city, those historical factors continue to play out. So even the built environment of the city reflects that, right? So the Northwest is a perfect example. We're saying it's 10 times the rates of COVID for the rest of the city. What does the Northwest look like? You know, it is the transit routes there are buses. They're incredibly overcrowded. There's a lack of green space. Housing has been, you know, substandard for a long time. Again, the lack of investment in those communities. And yet those are the communities that are holding the city afloat right now. Those are where the essential workers are who don't have a choice but to go into work every day and have to do so in very crowded conditions. It's a service poor neighborhood, meaning that, you know, all of the investment in even social services tend to be in the downtown core. So if you are living in that neighborhood, you're having to get on a bus to travel out to both work and to get the social supports you need. So there's just all of these ways that racism structurally plays out in the city that we have to address. And no recovery is going to happen if we continue to turn away from these very ugly truths about the way that we are structured as a society.
And for the others, your reactions to this question, Emmanuel, Agapi, Lindsay, how do we start to do things differently?
If I can interject, I think first and foremost, I think we need to have BIPOC leaders and in the case of Black communities, Black community leaders at the policy table. They need to be able to be there equally, having those types of critical discussions around recovery with governments and foundations. And I think be bold enough, as I said earlier on, to move away from, you know, patterns of funding and engagement that have not created the types of results that we need. I mean, we don't have in our city a strong Black community sector. It's fragmented. It has been under resources for a long time. And so what we have is like the frontliners that are serving the Black community, especially the grassroots. They have struggled to access resources and support during this pandemic. And I think we need to go back to really revisit how governments and funders engage with racialized communities. And in doing that, we must have the leaders from these communities at the policy table.
I would add to, I agree completely with Emmanuel. I think that we need to start creating space for voices to self-determine solutions that work for them. So in the context of working with Indigenous folks at the table, it's about recognizing that there isn't a one size that fits all approach. And I worry sometimes that we get comfortable, you know, with terminology. So and with all due respect to, you know, sort of notions of BIPOC, I think, you know, that there's also a laziness that comes with that, truthfully. You know, if we say BIPOC, we're not spelling out what that means. We're not spelling out what we're talking about, how it's different, how it might be the same. I think that there needs to be greater recognition for our unique differences. I think we need to celebrate and acknowledge that there is not, you know, sort of this cookie cutter approach. The responses that we might require may look very different to our community than another community. And some of it may look the same given the high degree of intersectionality that occurs as well. So I think we should be mindful of first and foremost the history here. And to Mohini's point, you know, Canada has a long history and legacy around colonizing Indigenous folks. And so, and it's not a history either, it's a contemporary issue for us. And you certainly can open a newspaper and see that at any given time in any part of Canada, Indigenous folks are still fighting for rights that are unique to Indigenous folks alone, with respect to land, with respect to culture, with respect to identity, and that list goes on and on. And I mean, in 2020, the fact that we live in, you know, what we call a first world country, and there are some people still disproportionately impacted by needing to, you know, fight for clean drinking water. We have a real problem here. And I think it starts with understanding that true history and moving us along a trajectory that employs allowability for self-determination within the construct of how we have relationships with governments. And that really starts by creating space for Indigenous folks at the table, and not space for one seat, because I think that's too comfortable, that's too easy. And one person does not speak for us all. Certainly, I don't sit here and speak for every Indigenous person today. I speak only from my own experience. And so I think it's about being mindful and respectful of creating, you know, more than one seat. And that, you know, infamous quote about sort of, you know, having to bring your own chair, a folding chair. I think, you know, bring many chairs. for all communities that are being underserved and that haven't had a voice historically.
Agapi, anything to add here?
I mean, I would just say, I've said this like many times before, but I really think that we have a unique, everything that we're talking about is not new. I think it's been heightened by the pandemic, but how Indigenous people, how Black people have been treated in this country is not a secret. It's very evident. And I think that we need to think, if we look at the incarceration rates, if we look at child welfare, if we look at all the stats have already been there. I think now the masses have it. I don't know if we do not move in this moment in history, I really do not know how many more generations we're going to promise equity to. You know, our grandfathers, fathers, like it's been generations of like, don't worry, your time's coming, sit tight. And I don't think that we have that luxury anymore. I think we need to acknowledge that a lot of people say, oh, well, why BIPOC or why Black, why Indigenous, why people of color? The data clearly tells us that we have a problem. It's just like a math, you know, if you're doing a test, you do the hardest questions first, Black and Indigenous BIPOC people, Indigenous Black BIPOC people in that order. If you solve the problems of these groups, then you will automatically, number one, solve the problems of most of Canadians, and then any other issues become a lot more easier to come by. So we need to figure out, and I think the problem, and I personally feel like I don't care how we get to that place, if it's by policy, by force, by mandate, I don't care how you feel about it, as long as you're doing it. And so I think that we need to seriously look at people who not force, technically in some instances we may need to force feed it, but equity needs to come hell or high water. And coming out of this pandemic, we need to figure out how corporate Canada, who benefit from our communities, how the non-for-profit sector and how government can work together to create an ecosystem where we're creating equity for everybody. If not now, it will never happen. We're gonna wait for, when was the last pandemic? Like, I don't even know the year, but it was a very, very long time ago, generations ago. We don't have generations to solve this issue. And the one thing I also will say is we really need to reflect, if the land that we are on Indigenous land, and I often say to Black community members, if we are looking for equity, we need to look at how this country treats Indigenous people, whose land we are on. Mm-hmm. If they can't get the respect and the rights that they're asking for, then we can't expect anything more. So I think we really need to reflect on that, and as Black communities also be in solidarity with Indigenous folks, because as good as they're getting, we're gonna get like one step less, you know? So we really need to think about that as we're thinking about equity and moving into how we do things differently after this.
I think you've all spoken to some versions of this, that what we're seeing right now during this pandemic are just long-standing issues that have just been magnified or exposed with this virus. At the local, we actually have a whole issue coming out at the end of the month called Fault Lines, and it's really tracing the longer arc on this pandemic, looking at more historical factors that have contributed to the damage that we're seeing now. But the next question very much relates to that. So these are long-standing issues, but how do we ensure that there's more accountability for measurable change going forward?
I'm just going to jump in and answer that. I personally think that we need to start in corporate Canada and government everywhere where you're hiring folks. I really think we need to start imposing diversity audits. Just like every year, not-for-profit or charity comes in and they pick up a receipt, they ask you questions about your finances, what did you do, what was the process, etc. The same thing needs to happen when it comes to equity. I think that we need to look at how we're hiring people, and I think this is the other piece, is that often people are saying, oh, well, we just can't find any people of color who are qualified. Okay, well then I need you to document where you're actually reaching out to these people. What community organizations or what platform online are you going into to advertise this job? When the person actually comes in, what is your reason for hiring, you know, Ted over Susan? I think if you document that, just like when we run our processes as non-for-profits, we're very thorough because we know that the auditor will come in and ask questions and we need to have answers. So if you have a diversity audit at the end of the year and your diversity auditor says, why did you hire, you know, Ted over Susie? You have a very clear answer as to why you did that. And especially if Susie just so happens to be a Black woman or an Indigenous woman or a person of color, we need to have a clear understanding and a well-documented reasoning as to why that happened. I think if we implement diversity audits, then people will be a lot more mindful about being, you know, biased or not hiring folks based off of their address or the plethora of reasons why we have the unemployment rate that we have. I think it will offer a lot more accountability to our communities when it comes to hiring practices, at least.
I think if I can add to Agape, I think the diversity audits are very, very important. But also we need to work with both the influencers, in this case, funders and governments who invest in the communities to have a level of standards in terms of the diversity that we need to see at the governance tables. We need to have, you know, these umbrella organizations that are active in the sector. There are several of them, to really have some minimum standards around diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in terms of the type of leadership for the sector, because at the moment, you know, as agents of change, the sector itself is not diverse and inclusive. The other thing that's critically important, we need to follow the money. We need to follow where the funds are going. And I think part of this, you know, NAPSI has been working with several funders to talk about the need to really fund in a smart way, smart grant making, focus on systems change. And as you do that, create a level of accountability within the sector itself in terms of how you fund, but also be introspective about your own role as funders and government. So there's a multi-pronged approach that we should consider in terms of creating, you know, a new reality for racialized and indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm. On the funding issue, I know since the pandemic hit, there's been a variety of emergency funds and programs that have popped up. Can you speak to the difference between getting these one-time funds to do various things versus more stable long-term funding to help with doing the kinds of things that you do on an ongoing basis? Anybody want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I mean, that really hits on such a critical issue where it's obviously always great to be able to get a grant. However, when you get one with, you know, March 31st deadline by which that program that turns out to be great, it's critical, you know, it's centering your service users, it's equity-based, and then you have to end it and then spend all of this energy that you could be spending actually as an organization advocating for larger system levels change, or, you know, watching your community respond, evaluating programs, seeing where you need to, you know, respond differently, what works, what doesn't. And instead it keeps you in this continuous cycle of chasing money, you know, trying to fit yourself into the version of whatever donor it is that has the money, wants you to be. And so it becomes very sort of at the whim also of donors and their different, you know, perspectives and life experiences. So it's not sustainable. It really takes power away actually from communities and nonprofits, and it perpetuates a really problematic power dynamic of a charity model that's not okay. And so, you know, for us, for example, in the middle of this pandemic, we got this amazing one-time grant around a BIPOC equity and access facilitator, specifically to address the mental health degradation, like really the mental health collapse of survivors of violence at this time, and particularly survivors of violence who are racialized, finding that, you know, systems, organizations, programs are not built to center the experiences of people of color, of Indigenous people. And so we had to bring in someone, and it's working out really well. But, you know, this program ends on March 31st. And then what happens, right? And how are you supposed to advocate for this program where the funding, all you hear is that, you know, core stable funding doesn't exist. So that is really, it's a huge issue. And in an equitable recovery, it is something that governments need to put a gender, an equity, or race lens around their funding, invest in what they want, the changes that, not what they want, what people want, what we want to see happen differently. And these equity recovery plans have to center people over profits, just across the board. And so that stabilizing of nonprofits and of communities through investment is critical.
I think a quick comment for me is, and we've been really advocating a lot around this, and NAPSI has collaborated with C Center for Black Young Professionals to really address these inequities around accessing of even COVID emergency response funding for Black grassroots. And we had to come with alternative ways, cluster application process and so on, to facilitate pathways to funding. I think what's critically important is, there has to be alignment. You know, there are a number of funders, foundations, the different levels of government that are funding these communities, but sometimes are not talking to one another. Yeah, it's very, very important to really not only maximize the impact of the funding, but think about how do we move from project funding only. And there is a place for project funding, but core or general operating support for community organizations is critically important. And so for me, I think it's just like, you know, that's why I talk about this concept of smart grant making. We need to be able to bring leaders of this community to sit at the table together with funders, governments and foundations, have a discussion about the solutions, the scope of the challenge, and then talk about what type of resourcing is needed to kind of scale the solutions, if you want, for these communities.
I would also add that the funding relationship between funders and fundees has to change. It has to evolve. We're in 2020, and I think, you know, our organization right now is in, you know, sort of exploring this concept of, can we assess our funders? Can we evaluate them to determine fit, alignment, the relationship? Is it working? Is it not? And to your point, Emmanuel, are we talking? Do we share the same values? Do we understand each other? Is there respect, trust, reciprocity? Do we have, you know, a relationship that is grounded in all of those things? And I think it's not anymore just about a transactional relationship. It's about meaningfully and understanding each other on a heart-to-heart, spirit-to-spirit level. I will say with confidence, and this isn't to boost Toronto Foundation because we're on their webinar, but it's the truth. We have a very good relationship with many of the staff, and that key point, many of the staff, not one single person. We talk to multiple people within the organization, and they talk to all of us, both as an organization, as a coalition, with the members independent of us, and they've really demonstrated action that aligns with their words. And we respect that. We respect that we share the same, you know, values, the same vision for wanting to create space for Indigenous-led organizations to access funding, because, you know, philanthropy still gives us 0 to 1% across the board, and we know that. And so, you know, albeit again, sort of a small but mighty, right, situation. Toronto Foundation may not be the largest foundation in the whole of the city, but it is acting with a might that is highly impressive. And it's that relationship piece that we can pick up the phone and call each other. And so, you know, when we get to that place of bringing to life this idea of a relationship tool that evaluates our funders, our friends, our relationships to determine where should we spend our energies and where should we not. It's not like saying, well, you know, we don't need the money. We do need the money. But we also have to be principled people and remember to have our integrity intact when we're accepting funding, because sometimes you get, you know, a small grant for $2,500. You got to jump through hoops, you know, 20-page report for $2,500. We have 3 staff, you know, it's not reasonable. So we have to rethink the relationship to create better power balance within that relationship. And I think we also have to rethink how we propose things, how we report on things. I mean, owners reporting, name a nonprofit that has heavy administrative side that can do all that work. I think we also need to be realistic about what it's like on the ground, and funders need to understand that stuff.
So let's bring that back to philanthropy. Why are donors so essential in this equitable recovery and in strengthening the nonprofit sector, both when they write the check and afterwards? How do you want to see the philanthropy sector support this recovery?
I would probably, or go ahead, Lindsay.
Go ahead. It's okay. I just spoke.
No, I was just going to say, I think that it's really important for people to understand. I've always said it's easier to convince an individual donor or a smaller institution rather than a large institution like a government to what you're trying to do. In a lot of ways, I think the nonprofit sector were really behind. And so one of the things that I really value when it comes to funder relationships, and I was actually just having this conversation with Maitri yesterday, is the ability for us to be able to try things. The reality is, like, our communities haven't really seen a significant difference in these numbers in, years. And so obviously we still have to find the solution, right? And so that requires us to try new things. And when funders allow us to do that, it allows us to try something. And if it doesn't work, we still get a lesson out of that. And I think, at C, I always say C to this day is just a series of learned lessons. The founders, Kofi Hope and Shireen Ashman, tried a bunch of things, and we know what doesn't work and we know what works, right? So there's still beauty in that. And I think that convincing individual donors to really understand what giving to a 3B organization, Black led, Black serving, and Black focused, what does that actually mean? C, Center for Young Black Professionals, NAPSI, both of our organizations are what you would call 3B, led by Black folks, focused. Our mandate is on Black communities. What does that do? It allows us to, everything that we do is in the context of being Black and in Canada. Specifically at C, when we talk about, when we're doing soft skills with these young people, it's dealing with the realities that we're looking at labor gaps where nobody else is. Why? Because if we get in the line with everyone else, then everyone else is going to get chosen before us. So where are we going to find a gap where there's low-hanging fruits, where we can get in there and it's good paying jobs and it's an opportunity for upward mobility, right? Same thing with when we have soft skills conversations. We have modules that are being Black in the workplace. How do you have a conversation with somebody you would never interact with outside of your workplace? You have nothing in common with them. How are you going to spark up a conversation? How are you going to navigate a space where you're the only Black person in the room? How are you going to advocate on behalf of your values or stay true to who you are? All of those things are things that someone who is not coming from a culturally relevant lens is not going to be able to equip these young people with, because we're giving them the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yes, racism sucks and the unemployment rates are horrendous, and we would like somebody to do something about it. But until we get there, these are the tools that you need to equip yourself with when you're entering into these institutions, into these spaces, etc. And so I think, though, also dealing with trauma, our communities are dealing with everything that we see on the news. All of those things create trauma inside of us. I experience vicarious trauma by just watching particular videos. The pain and the racism is on display for everybody to intake, and it's specifically for Black communities even harder. So I say all of that to say we really need to understand, donors really need to understand the relevancy of culturally relevant programming, and understand that our communities are best to come up with the solutions, and donors and foundations become allies in that work by helping us fund it to move it forward. But I really do think that donors really need to start to think about why this work is important, and the issues that people are facing. Because I think if an idea comes to, or a project comes to light, and you don't understand the systemic issues that this population is facing, then it might not seem like a great idea to you, right? Because it doesn't make sense for your population. So I think people getting more knowledge about the issues that BIPOC communities are experiencing, and also giving flexibility and understanding around it, I think is the best approach.
Great. Really quickly, and we need to jump to the Q&A with the audience here, but hearing about all the intense and amazing work that your organizations do and provide, I'm curious, how are you doing and how are your teams doing? Mohini, I see you're smiling
I mean,
there.
I'm laughing because thank you for that question. It is very nice to be asked. I think nonprofit leaders, we are potentially just like maybe we've got like half an inch of rope left. But you know, beyond me, my staff is just incredible. What they are having to do right now and what they are continuing to advocate for. I don't know how they come to work every day and do the volume of work that they do, find the creative solutions that they have to, because everyone is doing way more with way less. And while the demands, I mean, with an anti-violence organization, something I meant to call out is like the viciousness of the violence that survivors are coming in with is off the charts. And it's, you know, levels of vicarious trauma around violence in front of you. It's levels of vicarious trauma watching people's options disappear, you know, housing disappear, and working in that field every day with people you really care about in your communities, you're often from the community, has just been an incredible toll. So it's a really, really difficult time. And I think as we have this conversation about equitable recovery, really also keeping in mind those frontline workers, those essential workers who are putting themselves, you know, on the line so that a lot of us can continue to have access to some supports and continue to function as a city. Like, but thank you for asking. It's a hard time. Yeah.
I think quickly, Ty, I need to give credit to some, obviously to my staff and how we've been pacing our work. To our partners, I mean, I mentioned Agape in terms of the organization that she leads. So they have been incredible in terms of stepping in and working with us during the pandemic. I think we have, you know, really amazing staff within government and some of the funders that have reached out and asked, how can we be helpful? And the level of flexibility that they have shown during this pandemic needs to be named and acknowledged. So thanks for asking, but I think there are a number of things that have happened in the relationship that we have with funders and Black leaders, allies that like ONN and so on, that I know Cassie and Urban Race Relations and others that have made our work easier.
Great. So let's at this point open it up for some of the Q&A from the audience. There's a ton, so we obviously can't answer all of them, and I hope that the Toronto Foundation team has been active in fielding and answering some of the questions. So the first question I'm going to take is from Amber Morley, and it relates back to the very first question I asked you in this roundtable. Representation of BIPOC leaders with lived experience at decision-making tables and elected office is critical to progress on so many levels: policing, housing, access to recreation, etc. How can we better support racialized folks, especially women, in leadership pursuits?
I think we need to think differently about credential criteria for starters. I think within Indigenous concepts, for some of us, there's the notion of gifts, those natural gifts that you're born with, that you come here with. And so we are conditioned to a Western view that you must look at someone's resume to determine how well decorated they are to get them a seat at some of these tables. And I think that's the failing of society, because we are missing out on a whole plethora of folks who have tremendous things to offer us as communities. I think we in sort of nonprofits, and I don't speak for all of us, but certainly I think we value that. But others who are at sort of that policy or big P policy decision-making sort of space, governments, funders, and beyond, creating space and opportunity to see it differently. I actually could care less what a resume says. I want to know who you are as a person and what you bring to the table. And I think lived experience is something that, you know, you can't learn that. You can't read about that. You can't learn that in a book. With all due respect, you walk that every day, right? Some people have PhDs in life and there's no letters beside their name, and you got to respect that. It's important.
Okay. We have a question from, I hope I get the name right, Merle Chris, to the panelists here. Have your priorities changed in the last 6 months, or is it that the problems have become more intense?
I would say our priorities have changed tremendously in terms of, I mean, these are all issues that have been there in the past, food insecurity, we have always had a hardship fund. So if somebody needed childcare or extra food in their fridge, those types of things, they could put a request in. When we say we had to change our priorities, we literally have become like, we deliver food every Friday. These are things that are not sustainable for us to continue to do unless somebody, funds us to do that. But I think that our priorities have intensified, like we talked about earlier. Usually we have 15 or 30 young people at any given time that we're serving with intense case management. Overnight, we had 142. So that means the 2 or 3 social workers on our team and the psychotherapist all of a sudden, I don't even know how many times quadrupled their caseload. So that means that we've been needing to, and then also all of these one-time COVID relief funds have come through, and we're able to provide food and all of that to folks. The thing that we're trying to figure out now is the ramifications of COVID are going to be a lot more long lasting than these COVID relief funds. And so what are we going to do with folks who have food insecurity when our food boxes run out and we can't buy gift cards? Like, these are things that will likely, getting people back and employed is going to take some time. So we're now trying to figure out, how do we maintain that a priority and perhaps create new partnerships or ways for other organizations to partner with us to provide those needs, but still go back to, the core of what we were doing, and also be able to produce more alumni. We need more people. Unemployment rates are up. We need more people to be trained. But what's going to happen to the alumni and the folks who've already come through our doors that are still in dire need of help? And that's a big question mark for us right now.
Right. Next question is from Jacobed Wembai. It relates to job and economic opportunity. 90% of people interviewing me for jobs were non-Black. Most of the interviews were just for them to see who this highly educated and skilled woman is, a Black woman. They own it all. How do we change that?
Agapi, do you want to address that?
I was calling your name.
Okay, let me. I mean, thanks, Jacobet, a friend of mine who asked this question. That's the challenge that we have, and I think that it goes back to really some of the points that Agapi was saying earlier on in terms of revisiting our hiring practices, and I think people like Jacobet and others that bring a lot of years of experience and education, they should be able to really be there and recognized for what they offer and hired for who they are, rather than, put on the periphery because of frankly speaking, the skin of their, the color of their skin. So some of the things that we need to do, obviously, we need to be able to go back and bring employment equity again here. We need to be able to really, work with the corporate sector and governments and employers to introduce this type of hiring practice that address unconscious bias. And, we didn't speak a lot today about how at the root of all this is a specific form of racism we call anti-Black racism. And we need to be able to really pinpoint how this manifests in the process of alienating people in employment and keeping them on the periphery. So my recommendation here is to be able to really continually fight the type of anti-Black racism that manifests in the employment sector, but also creating those pathways for support for people like Jacobet, where their credentials and experience is recognized. I think TRIA comes to mind, for example, the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council, which tried to bring together employers and corporate sector governments to deal with the issue of the exclusion from the employment of internationally educated professionals. So that approach for me is also something that maybe we need to almost bring a track model to addressing some of the systemic challenge that we see in Black communities and racialized communities.
Great. And with that, I think we wrap up this portion of the agenda. Thanks, Emmanuel, Mohini, Lindsay, Agapi. Very insightful discussion and not nearly enough time to talk about everything. And thank you to all the audience members for putting in their questions. And of course, there's a very lengthy report that you all have now that would dive deeper into some of these issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Sharon to wrap things up. Sharon?
Thank you so much, Ty, for your thoughtful moderating. And wow, I've just, I actually typically participate in the chat a lot more, but I was so taken in by this conversation. And I want to highlight the 4 things that really stood out for me, although it was really hard to choose the messages I think we need to leave with today. And so I want to start with Mohini's bold challenge that everything needs to change. And I'm here I sit in the privileged role as a white, affluent leader of an institution, one of the 80% of the big institutional leaders in the data. And I think we all have to increase our white consciousness, and we all have to take on this bigger challenge. Emmanuel, building on that we need to stop tinkering at the edges, and we need to start drilling down. Enough solving the symptoms. Let's get to the core solutions, and let's get the right people at the table for that conversation. And Lindsay, who we just value your relationship and all that we have learned, the idea of a circle of a large number of chairs. This isn't a one-seat solution. This isn't tokenism. This is real relationship and an opportunity for self-determination. And I love the idea of funder assessments. We got to talk about that one. I think that's really interesting and could become a fascinating extension of vital signs work in the future. And then finally, Agapi. Wow. If not now, right? If not now, we cannot, what is it? How many generations more can we promise a change in equity to? How many more? And with that, I think I couldn't sum up this conversation better. And I am so grateful to be in a sector with this kind of powerhouse expertise. I think that if there are funders and donors on this call, I hope you are listening so deeply to what this group and so many of the organizations that are out there on the front lines of these issues, the power of what they do. And they're not the big institutions. They don't sit on large endowment funds. They need your support more than ever before, and they need it undesignated. They need it to operate core funding. It needs to be multi-year. And I know so many of our fund holders do that, but I put that call out every time because that is an easier action for everyone to participate in. But what I love in the chat is how many connections were made today, ideas for engagement and volunteering beyond the dollar, because philanthropy isn't just for rich people. Philanthropy is a way of being. It is a caring for humanity. And that's really at the end of the day, what we want to this report to inspire and this work. In 2 weeks, we'll be doing this again with more folks and more issues. Thursday, November 26th from 8 to 9. We hope you will join us to talk about 4 scalable ideas. You will be getting a follow-up email from today's conversation that will include the recording and an invitation to join us again. And please, if this has been useful to you, tell others, invite them. You don't have to be a grantee or a fund holder at Toronto Foundation to come and be a part of this conversation. We have a vision to engage large groups of philanthropists. And I've already told you that our definition of that isn't about wealth. It is about a commitment to being a part of a community and supporting each other and creating a more equitable future for all of us. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Ty, for your brilliant moderation, and all of our guests and all of the folks that have stuck around for the full 90 minutes. Stay healthy. We're going into the second wave. Stay healthy, stay together, stay connected. Hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, folks.